Great. I will indeed talk some about that. So that works really well because you guys have filled a lot of space of things that I want to talk about. First, I want to say I really appreciate being here today. I think this is such an important topic and such an important audience. And I'm particularly delighted that this is a collaboration between the AFT and the AAUP because I do think there is a very important continuum from K all the way through graduate education that we need to be thinking about when we talk about freedom of expression, academic freedom, democracy and its future, and polarization and the threats that polarization, the threats that polarization poses to democracy, as well as the threats that the undermining of our norms of freedom of expression poses. So I also want to begin by saying a word about what's happening this morning all over the United States. I don't know yet how the demonstrations that the high school students and lower grade students organized turned out, and we certainly don't know yet how many of them will be punished and how many of them will be applauded and supported. But I would say that that is a fabulous manifestation of the image behind my work, that we need to teach children from the youngest ages how to be active citizens, how to exercise their expressive rights, and how to learn how to communicate and demand to be listened to, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum or what their particular goal is. And that is part of the premise of my book, Lessons in Censorship, in which I argue that schools routinely violate the rights of students to express themselves because they ignore the law, don't understand the law, and simply establish the wrong models. And so students are not learning how to exercise their rights to liberty. And those are hard because we need to understand how to talk to each other, how to be exposed to views we disagree with, even when put in obnoxious ways. And one of the best ways to do that is under adult supervision in school, as opposed to being told you're going to be protected from hurt feelings, nobody can talk that way, shut up, which is the message that they're mostly getting in our public schools. And of course, public schools K through 12 teach almost 90% of our population. They are our best opportunity to form a cohesive society in which we have shared values, and we are abandoning that prospect because we're not engaging in civics education, in part because of the Koch brothers who have undermined that, in part because it has fallen off the radar with our emphasis on STEM and things that lead directly to jobs. And I'm not saying jobs aren't important. I'm not saying math isn't important. But all of these things are important, and we need to put them back in place. So part of my argument is that democracy depends on teaching constitutional rights, constitutional norms, and most important, freedom of expression, which is the sine qua non of having a functioning democracy. So the problem begins in K through 12. And then we have students arriving at college campuses where they have not learned how to deal with difference, and they don't know about their own rights, and they don't know about the rights of other people, including those they disagree with. And so we have very disturbing not only behaviors among students who shout down teachers, not teachers, outside speakers primarily, demand to be protected from offensive speech in the classroom and outside the classroom, but we have enormous amounts of survey data showing a diminishment of respect for these very fundamental values of free speech. And I'm going to focus more on the free speech than the academic freedom side of the equation, though they are interrelated, but I agree with much of what Professor Reichman said about the distinction between academic freedom and free speech. So that also, so most recently this week, we have a new survey released by Wright, but in collaboration with ACE, and others, which shows that, again, erosion, College students think diversity is more important than free speech by a margin of 53 to 46%. Majority think diversity trumps, pardon the use of that word, free expression. 39% of college students say it's okay to shout down speakers you disagree with. 39% think that's okay. In a survey about free speech, so they've already been kind of oriented. We're talking about freedom of expression. This isn't in with a jumble of things like, do you rather eat cereal for breakfast than eggs? And 10% say it's okay to silence speakers through the use of violence. So no wonder we have problems. So when these students arrive on campus, they need remedial attention, so long as K through 12 schools aren't doing their job, and there are a few places that are starting to do that. I've argued that part of freshman orientation, in addition to sensitizing people to the dignity of your peers and to diversity and to the range of people who you will encounter in college, we should also be teaching them about freedom of expression and the fact you will be exposed to things that make you uncomfortable, and it's part of the reason you've gone to college. As Harry Calvin, a major First Amendment scholar, said in a report for the University of Chicago decades ago, and it remains the most important thing, I think, most important message, a good university like Socrates will be upsetting. You who enter here prepared to be upset. That's part of being challenged, rethinking, taking apart what you took for granted growing up in your sheltered community at your parents' kitchen table. Be open to new ideas, new experiences. Take it apart, reconstruct it, critical thinking. That's our job as educators. So Purdue is one example. The Chronicle did a great piece on what Purdue is doing in teaching students about freedom of expression, and there are a number of other models. Students have also, in K through 12, experienced a diminished range of opinions and ideas in the classroom, and that is related to a change in the legal doctrine about the rights of teachers who are not college professors with tenure, and where some notion of academic freedom used to be applicable in K through 12. Increasingly, the federal courts are taking the view that teachers are hired to speak and to deliver only the message that the school system has assigned to them. And that means they can't bring in many instances, supplementary materials that contradict the curricular materials chosen by the school board or the official textbook, and increasingly that they can't say something in their lecture or even answer a student's question. So that means that the only source of intellectual diversity in a high school classroom or an elementary school classroom may be the words of other students. And how are students to know which of their peers is saying something that they need to take into account unless the teacher validates it in some way? So that is also a very constricted learning environment that is, I think, damaging for that K through 12 experience. And remember, we still have an enormous number, the majority of our students are not going on to college, even today. So that's the end of their education, that's all they've gotten. And for those who are going to college, they're not prepared for that give and take and that controversy. Controversy is what they're asking to be protected from. So that is very dangerous. So now that brings me to college. The First Amendment and its protection of free speech is only mandatory in public schools and colleges, community colleges through graduate schools. But the vast majority of private institutions have undertaken to respect freedom of expression, and is part of what they promise their students. So if they promise a campus that respects free expression, the standards by which we measure that are the standards developed in the context of the First Amendment, and I think that we can hold colleges and universities accountable when they say we offer freedom of expression. Some colleges expressly say we're not a free expression place. Primarily, those are religious institutions, and they're perfectly free to do that. Their students are on notice, and arguably, unless they're bound by a full scholarship or something, they can choose to go elsewhere. That is not the state's business. But the vast majority of colleges claim to be operating as zones in which academic freedom and freedom of expression are respected. So what are the key First Amendment principles that apply in colleges where free speech is being recognized, as well as in the larger universe of the body politic? The most important is that freedom of expression exists to protect what Justice Holmes called in our shorthand the thought we hate. It is there for the dissident, for the cantankerous, for the unpopular speaker. The person whose speech is popular does not need the speech clause of the First Amendment. The second is that if speech is protected, and there are some kinds of expression that are not, I don't need to go into them now, but one obvious example is obscenity or defamation. But if it's protected speech, it is protected against both prior restraint, meaning the state silences you before you can even express yourself, publish your statement, speak up, but it also protects you from punishment after the fact. That is also censorship if the speech is protected. That's illegal. The third principle is that the First Amendment response, not only the preferred response, but really the only acceptable, the best response, is more and better speech. You mentioned the marketplace of ideas. That is the construct for much of our First Amendment doctrine. We put all the ideas out there, no matter how lacking in foundation, no matter how foolish and immoderate, in the words of one Supreme Court opinion, no matter how offensive. They go out there, and in the marketplace, the noxious speech will be drowned out by better speech, and speech that has a better foundation in evidence, in science, in whatever belief system we're talking about, and the entirely insane speech will fall of its own accord, of its own weight. And the fourth very important principle, which is misnamed, we call it the heckler's veto. It is actually a bar on allowing hecklers to veto speech they don't like. And it means that when an unpopular speaker is out there, we don't allow a mob to drown them out. It is the job of the state to protect the unpopular speaker and to break up the mob. And that is part of what we've been seeing recently on college campuses, and it is not okay to allow speakers to be silenced in that way. So, is there actually a crisis on college campuses today? We've got a lot of events in the news, and a lot of them are very disturbing, and they have to do with the speech of students, of professors, of outside speakers, of demonstrators, counter-demonstrators, risks of violence, actual violence, and they are kind of head-spinning, and they seem to be something new, although they're not unprecedented. But PEN America, I think, did a great report going on 2 years ago in which they said there isn't a crisis because, after all, there are more than 7,000 institutions of higher learning in this country. And there are dozens or maybe 100 such incidents a year, and they may be growing in number, and they may be growing in intensity, and they may be on the front pages, but most colleges have not had these incidents. So not a crisis, but something we need to pay attention to, because if these trends are left unintended, then our norms could be seriously undermined, and we could also have a spread of these kinds of incidents and a deficit in our understanding of the best ways to handle them. So we need to pay attention. We also need to disaggregate both the kinds of speakers whose speech is being interfered with and the ways in which it's being interfered with. So here I want to propose a number of ways of disaggregating that I think have constitutional significance. So the first is, who are the speakers and what are they doing there? And I completely agree with what Sigal said about the use of scarce university resources and about what we teach in classes. So universities are different from other kinds of state organizations because they have a mission, and I agree with what Sigal said that mission is. And in pursuing that mission, they have to make choices. They decide, what departments are we going to have? Within those departments, what courses are we going to offer? And similarly, we have limited resources, spaces, and time. And so if a university is going to invite a speaker formally, or say you're the commencement speaker, it's going to make choices. It's going to choose speakers who it thinks have something important and presumably consistent with the academic enterprise to communicate and to share. So the first, we have those official institutional invitations to speakers. Then we have people who are invited by a faculty member, perhaps to be a guest speaker in a class or as part of an institute that is funded by the university or has outside funding. This is also an official invitation to a speaker. Then we have speakers who are invited by students. And there I would differentiate between the speakers who are invited by organized student groups that have a real presence on campus, and at most universities are, by university I mean community college, college and university, are authorized to invite speakers, and those are also invited guests that presumably promote something that is integral to the college's mission. Increasingly, however, we see three other groups of speakers, and these are the speakers that tend to be the ones around whom the turmoil develops, although it has also developed with regard to guest speakers and so forth. So first, an individual student or one or two students who have outside funding to bring a controversial speaker, and they suddenly say, we're now a club, and we'd like to invite this speaker. And I'm not really saying colleges should be in the business of saying, well, you're a real club and you're not a real club, but there are some kind of red flags that go up when that happens. Then we have a speaker who invites him or herself because part of the university is designated as what we call a public forum. Anybody can come and speak there. That's what Yiannopoulos did when he went to Sproul Plaza for his second visit last year. It's a public space. He just came and said, I'm giving a talk for 15 minutes. It cost the university roughly $800,000 to preserve public safety. Or they take advantage of some alumni status or other relationship with the university that some universities say those people can use our spaces. They can apply for a permit to give a speech, and that's how some of Richard Spencer's talks unfolded. Or universities increasingly, in part because of the squeeze in funding, rent spaces to the public. And you can show up and say, I'm prepared to write a check, and I want to give a speech, and I'm renting a space, and that is the main way that Richard Spencer and other white nationalists have come to campus. They invite themselves, and they pay rent for a space. So universities are absolutely free to say, we're not going to do that anymore. They're not free to say, Richard Spencer, you can't come, we find your views obnoxious, because that is content and viewpoint discrimination, which the First Amendment absolutely bars. But they can say, we don't want our spaces used that way, they are too precious. We're no longer renting space. So we should distinguish among those speakers. Universities may well want to reconsider how they allow people to come in a way that does not involve scrutinizing the content of the expression. And then we also need to think about what you can do permissibly when the noxious speaker shows up. Because universities are what we call government speakers, and government speakers are allowed to have their own message as well, and particularly when they're an educational institution. So I said earlier in K through 12, there was a problem if only the government speaker is in the classroom, only the approved textbook and the approved script for the teachers. I'm uncomfortable with that, but there's no question that the government gets to choose a curriculum, and the curriculum may have a viewpoint. The issue is, can other people disagree with it? So too at the college level. We have messages to give to our students, and one of them is respect and dignity. And so when people come to campus and they try to undermine those messages and those norms, it is absolutely appropriate for the university to distance itself and to give a contrary message, and to say, that speaker may be appearing on our campus, but I, the university president, and we as an institution, think this is a horrible message. We don't give it our stamp of approval. We disagree. We want to focus you on what is right and good. And that is not only permissible, but I would urge almost indispensable to keep students comfortable and safe without protecting them from having to run the risk of hearing things that are hurtful. There is no First Amendment exemption for hurtfulness. Hurtful speech is protected. We need to learn how to deal with it, but that doesn't mean that we say to the victims, you're the only people, or the targets, you're the only people who have to deal with it or have to respond to it. I think it is imperative on all of us to step up and say, you're not alone. We are all offended by this. And that is totally appropriate on a college campus. I have more to say about the risks to actual safety as opposed to the feeling of being verbally assaulted. And that, of course, is very much in the news today. Brings us kind of full circle to the morning's events, but I'll stop here.
It does. Thank you.